Hello and welcome to my video on the behaviourist approach in psychology. This video is dedicated to the AQA A-level specification, although it will be applicable to other A-level specifications and general interest in psychology as well. But this one is going to focus on the keywords and the evaluations that you need for the AQA A-level. Lots of really good videos already out there on the behaviourist approach, but not many dedicated towards this course, which is why I've made this video. So starting on that, let's have a quick look at the specification, which is here now. I've already done a video on the origins of psychology. If you haven't yet seen that, have a look at my profile, subscribe to my channel, and you'll see that one. But if you look here, after looking at the origins, you need to look at the 5 basic approaches in psychology, and that's what we're making a start on here, and I hope to go through each of them. So we'll look, as I say, at the behaviourist approach. You see there it's also called the learning theory, as it was on the specification, and there are specific reasons for that. Look at the behaviourist approach. It does what it says on the tin. So the behaviourist psychologists, they look at behaviour, funnily enough, and so they look at psychology, humans, looking at, well, how are they acting? What are we actually doing? And the reason for this is because it was almost a bit of a rejection of Wundt's idea of introspection, looking in at yourself. The behaviourist said, well, no, we're actually quite bad at doing that, and it's better to look at things that are observable, measurable, replicable, and that's a better way to look at it. And that almost moves psychology more towards science and the scientific method, and so that's why the behaviour side of things is really important. It's also called the learning theory, and you'll see in a second why that may be. So behaviourists believe that we are born as a blank slate, and actually the vast majority of what we do, how we act, comes from our environment. We learn it as we go on, and so that's why it's known as the learning theory as well. And you'll see these terms used kind of interchangeably, the behaviourist approach and the learning theory. Behaviourists also don't look at the thinking patterns that are going on. They believe, as I said, that the behaviour is the most important. That comes later on in maybe other approaches. So we'll look at the cognitive approach, which does look at the thinking processes, but then maybe not the behaviours. Okay, so without further ado, let's have a quick look at some of the theories within the behaviourist approach. So the first of these behaviourist theories is classical conditioning. That's a key term that you need to know, so write that down if you're making notes. And what classical conditioning is basically learning through association. Okay, so you associate one thing with another. And this has been widely credited as coming from someone called Ivan Pavlov in his famous Pavlov's dogs experiment. And basically what happened here is Pavlov was actually experimenting with something completely different. He was looking at whether dogs and how much they salivate when they're given food. Okay, so he'd come into the room, he'd give the dog a bowl of food, and he'd record how much saliva they produced, and he was doing variations of that. But what he started to notice was actually, after a little while, the dogs would salivate not just when they were given food, but when they saw him come into the room. Okay, and this was a bit of a strange finding at the time. People thought that dogs would only salivate when they were given the food, but it seemed as though the dogs were almost anticipating getting the food because they saw him, so they had associated him with the food and so salivated. So this got Pavlov thinking, and actually he then conducted a fair few other studies and then developed this classical conditioning learning through association theory. So here's how it goes. So in that first box up there, that's before conditioning. So what we know is that, yep, dogs are given food and they salivate. These are known as reflexes. So these are kind of almost pre-programmed. This is what humans do. You're given food and you salivate, or this is what dogs did. We then later apply that to humans. So given food and then salivate. There are some key terms that you need to know to go along with this. So the food, that happened already. Okay, so that UCS, that stands for unconditioned stimulus. Okay, so the food was the unconditioned stimulus, and that produced salivation. So that's known as the unconditioned response. So those things already happen. You give a dog food, and it salivates. The unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. To begin with, when Pavlov went into the room, he meant nothing to the dog, so there would have been no response. So in his later experiments, what he would do, he would ring a bell before he gave them food. So to begin with, the first time Pavlov did that, that bell meant nothing to the dogs. They didn't know they were going to get food after he rang the bell, until he repeated that several times. So this is the conditioning part of it. This is where the bell is being rung and they're getting food. Okay, so the unconditioned stimulus is being presented, which is the food. You've also got a neutral stimulus, a neutral response. So the bell to begin with is a neutral stimulus and it produces no response or a neutral response. Okay, but during conditioning they ring the bell and give the food. So the salivation's still there because it's unconditioned response. That's the salivation. Until eventually you do that a few times, and what happens is you ring the bell and the dog expects food. The dog has associated the bell with getting food. And so you ring the bell and the dogs then salivate at the sound of the bell without obviously getting the food because they associate that. So see what's happened here. The bell was rung to begin with and there was no response. After conditioning, the bell is rung and there's a response. So these are known as being conditioned. So eventually the bell becomes the conditioned stimulus and salivation becomes the conditioned response. So all of these terms you need to know. You need to be able to tell your teacher and examiner what the unconditioned stimulus is, what the unconditioned response is, what the neutral stimulus and neutral response is, and then what the conditioned stimulus and conditioned response was. And you can apply that to lots of different situations. Okay, so start thinking about, well, where in life have you had, maybe you've been conditioned. So think about maybe at school. What happens when the bell rings if you have a bell at your school? Okay, when you first heard that, you wouldn't have known what to do. But you hear that now, and that might signal break time or lunchtime, and so you automatically get up and go. Okay, so we're applying this theory. Although it was found with dogs, you can then apply it to humans. And we'll look at later in the psychology course, we come back to this. So this is why the approaches topic is quite good, because actually you come back to this in lots of different situations. So we're going to apply this later on in the psychology course to attachments, and maybe even phobias and mental health disorders and things like that. So you'll be using this same terminology, but you'll be applying it to different situations. Another application here, this is maybe how the advertising agencies and the media might use classical conditioning. Okay, so why do so many companies spend so much on advertising during Christmas? Well, okay, Christmas, you normally feel happy with that. You'll have grown up, hopefully you'll have had nice good Christmases, and you'd have got lots of presents. So your unconditioned stimulus would be Christmas, and at the moment for you that should hopefully produce an unconditioned response of happiness, excitement, being with family, etc. You've got a new product, and that new product, whatever it may be, in this example it's Coca-Cola, it's probably not new to you, but think of a new product coming onto the market. It makes sense for that company to get you to associate that with happiness, wouldn't it? Because it would make you then want that product. So at the moment, we'll say you've never had a can of Coca-Cola before. So you see this can, it produces no emotion for you, no response. Okay, so what they do is that they make you associate their product with something that you have a good unconditioned response for. So Coca-Cola, holidays are coming, holidays are coming. You know what I'm on about there. Until eventually, hopefully, you see a can of Coke and you think, oh, I'm now happy. Okay, so there are lots of different applications for this theory, and you're going to come back to that time and time again. But you do need to know that theory, you need to know about Pavlov and his experiments, and you need to know those terms. The next theory in the behaviourist approach is known as operant conditioning, and in its most basic form what this is learning through reward and punishment. Okay, there are some other terms that you also need to know that make this theory a little more complex, okay? And these terms are reinforcement and punishment. And for each of these, what you can have is positive and negative. So we'll go through and I'll try and explain this in a bit more detail for you. So if something is, according to operant conditioning, if something is known as positive, it's when it's added. Okay, and if something is known as negative, it's when it's taken away. So if we look at reinforcement to begin with, reinforcement is kind of as it says on the tin. If something is reinforced, it makes it stronger. Okay, so it increases the behaviour. The behaviour is more likely to happen. Okay, so a positive reinforcer is something that is added that makes behaviour more likely to happen. Okay, so if we think of an example, at school maybe, this is where you get a reward. It would be an excellent slip, a gold star, being given something for doing a particular behaviour. If you're given something, again, if we think in the wider world, being given a bonus for being the best salesman, that would be a positive reinforcement. It's something that's added that wasn't there before that increases the chance of that behaviour happening again. If we look at negative reinforcement, that is, so this is a bit strange. This is where the terms positive and negative, I think a bit of confusion can sometimes happen. So in the terms of operant conditioning, negative just means something is taken away. But you can have a negative reinforcer. So you can have something taken away that increases the chances of that behaviour happening again. So actually, negative reinforcement is almost a good thing. It will increase the behaviour happening again. So you may see people in your class getting shouted at if their homework is not handed in on time. Okay, so you might think, right, I'm going to do my homework because I want that taken away. I don't want to be told off, and so I don't want to get shouted at. So you do your homework, you hand it in, you don't get shouted at. That is something that's potentially happening, so being told off, that's taken away. So that's a negative reinforcer, so avoiding something negative. Okay. We then look at punishment, and again in punishment, obviously punishment is an unpleasant thing, and that decreases the behaviour. So if you get punished for something, that should mean it's less likely that that behaviour happens again, because you don't want that punishment in the future. Okay, so punishment is a decrease in behaviour. But again, you can have a positive punishment, something added that decreases the behaviour happening, and you can have a negative punishment, so something taken away that you don't necessarily want taken away. Okay, so again, if we look at this in terms of school type behaviour, a positive punishment, so something that added that decreased the behaviour, so something that maybe wasn't there before, we'll use the homework example again, getting told off. So if you don't do your homework, something that wouldn't have happened otherwise, being told off, is then introduced. So when you get told off, teachers would like to think that you wouldn't like that to happen again. Okay, so that's a positive punishment. It's something added that decreases the behaviour. And then again, if we look at the other side, a negative punishment, so it still would decrease the behaviour, but it's something taken away that you wouldn't want taken away. So your free time taken away, that's such as a detention, that is a negative punishment. If you're playing on your phone in class and it gets taken off you, that is a negative punishment, because it's something that otherwise you wouldn't want taken away that is taken away, that should hopefully decrease the behaviour happening again. Okay, clear as mud. The pictures that I've got here, so this guy here, this is B.F. Skinner, and he's kind of credited. So you've got Pavlov with the classical conditioning, Skinner's the one you should really know about with operant conditioning, and he came up with this little contraption here. It's known as Skinner's box, and this almost was an experiment that tried to see whether this theory, this operant conditioning, actually happened. Okay, and what you have here, you've got he put several animals in here: mice, rats, pigeons, and they had a couple of things happen. One, they had this little lever here, and basically the rat would run around Skinner's box and obviously doesn't know what happens to begin with. It doesn't know what the lever does. There's lights here, there's speaker, so there's sounds. The rat, first being introduced to that cage, doesn't know what's happening. The idea is, if he runs around and accidentally, because he might just do that, Bit bored? You'd be bored as well if you were running around a box. Little lever, oh, I'll tap that, see what happens. And so the rat tapped the lever, and what happened then? Food was distributed. And the rat thought, oh, brilliant, bit of food, quite hungry. And so, actually, after doing it once, might not know, he's got a reward, so he's got a positive reinforcer, but again, he might not necessarily associate that with the lever. If he did it again, you might start thinking, hang on a minute, every time I'm tapping this red lever, I'm getting a reward here. And then just go absolutely nuts, just start smashing the lever, getting loads of food, num num num, loving life. Okay, so the rat has learnt, so it's a learning theory, through operant conditioning, through positive reinforcement, that lever produces food. So that is a learned behaviour. That's a behaviour that wasn't there before, but now is there, that he's going to repeat because he gets a reward from it. Okay, so that's all nice. However, Skinner wasn't completely nice, because actually what happened here, the floor of Skinner's box was actually electrified. Okay, so in another part of the experiment, what Skinner might do is electrify the floor. Poor little ratty, not so happy now, running around trying to get away from the electricity, and again might randomly tap the lever, and this time the lever stops the electricity. So the rat's going to want to then press the lever again, so taking away something that increases the behaviour. That would be a negative reinforcement. So Skinner's box helps us to see that the theory of operant conditioning can actually work. Again, that can be applied to lots of different situations. I tried to apply that to obviously a school type situation when we're going through there, and we'll look at it again later on in the psychology course. Again, attachment can be potentially learned through feeding. Again, a baby might attach to its mother because it's getting a reward. So we'll look at that later on in the course, but for the moment you just need to know the theories of classical and operant conditioning when it comes to the behaviourist approach. So that's all I'm going to talk about in terms of the learning theory for this video. I'm going to make a separate one on the social learning theory, which does still come under the learning theory, but it's a slightly different view. So for now, we're going to look at some evaluation of this approach. Is it a good approach? Is it a good way to look at human behaviour or not? And kind of what are the strengths and weaknesses of it? So we'll start with the strengths. As I said to begin with, one of the better things about the behaviourist approach, specifically when maybe comparing it to other approaches or other way of looking at human behaviour, is that it does take this scientific stance. It looks at the observable. We can see behaviours, measurable. You can replicate. So when you're using this as an evaluative point, try and bring in examples of how can you say that the behaviourist approach does these things, and why is that a benefit being scientific? That's a good thing. I think one of the best things and one of the better evaluative points is the applications. Okay, you need to get this in when you're talking about evaluating the behaviourist approach. There are many applications in the real world that use this theory, and as I've suggested in this video, you will have had experience of this yourself. So schools and prisons, they use something known as a token economy, where you do something good, you get a reward, and that's supposed to encourage behaviour. Certainly primary schools do use this, and even going into secondary schools, and prisons use this as well to encourage the sorts of behaviours that they do want and discourage the behaviours they don't. So it's used every single day. And as well as that, and you'll see later on, I keep mentioning this, but in other topics, so in the abnormalities topic, the psychopathology topic, you will look at behaviourist theories of different disorders and treatments, and so it's used a lot. So one example is for phobias. So there's a theory that we learn to get phobias. We have negative associations or reinforcements from different stimulus, and that creates a phobia of, say, a snake or a spider, etc. That can then also lead to treatment. So the idea, if you believe that you have learnt to fear spiders, the idea is then, well, maybe you can unlearn it. And so there's this thing called systematic desensitization, where they try to, the idea would have been that you associated that stimulus, the spider, with a negative outcome, well, okay, let's try and associate it with a more positive outcome, relaxation, and being calmer, and that happens in systematic desensitization. So when you do look at that in the other approach, and you maybe ask questions on the behaviorist approach for the approaches topic, certainly, yeah, bring that in and use that as your evaluation and your AO3. I think that's one of the stronger AO3 points here. Weaknesses then, so it's certainly not a perfect approach. One of the issues is about determinism. Again, this comes in later in the course, maybe you'll look at it a bit more in year 2, but there are issues and debates in psychology, and we look at one of those is determinism versus free will. So determinism says that, well, something's going to happen regardless. Free will says you've got a bit of a choice in it. Well, the behaviourist approach is quite deterministic. It would say that your outcomes are kind of predetermined based on your environment. And so that has some issues if you think about that. Maybe get a bit philosophical, but say you're in an environment, you've been brought up in an environment that rewards aggression. So, I don't know, you may have parents that give you sweets every time you beat up your neighbour. And so you, according to the behaviourist approach, you would then develop and be aggressive later on in your life, and that has implicated, can you be arrested for that if you're aggressive towards someone in public because your environment has determined that? Does everyone that grows up in that environment turn out to be aggressive? I think you'll find there are examples where that doesn't happen, or vice versa, where people are aggressive where their environment hasn't been. And so that's a bit of an issue with this approach. It takes the free will out of it. It takes the choice and says that, well, what's going to happen to you is going to happen to you. And we know that there are lots of examples where that doesn't happen. So that's a problem with the approach. And last but not least, we've looked at a couple of examples here. Although the theories are applied to humans, and that's what you're going to need to do in your answers. If you start talking just about Pavlov's dogs and Skinner's box with the rats, we're talking about human psychology here, so you're going to need to apply that to humans. But obviously there are ethical issues in the research that was done. Obviously the electrified Skinner's box potentially causes stress, and any future research that's done, that needs to be taken into account in terms of the behaviourist approach. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I've rabbited on enough. Thank you very much for listening. Please do subscribe because I will be making the videos for all the other approaches, and we'll look at social learning theory next. Thank you very much.